Before we get into more of the kind of finance topics, there's a lot of questions about just content, how you learn to be a good writer, what your process is, not writing the book, but just kind of the more daily content you put out. Talk a little bit about, you get to Motley Fool. It sounds like you weren't a writer at all, didn't really understand what you were doing. Like, how have you picked up and honed that craft over time? And then what does your process look like today?
I think it was two things in the Motley Fool. One is that when I started, I was writing 3 articles per day, every 5 days a week, which is a tremendous amount. It's too much, and because I was playing the volume game, 3 articles a day, they weren't any good because I had an hour to think of an idea, type it out, and get it sent out. So it was just but that much volume when you're writing that much, 3 articles a day every day for years. Just that much experience, anyone will gain a little bit of skill in writing just by sheer repetition. The other thing that was really important is that these articles were public because Motley Fool had a big platform. Even though I was a brand new writer, tens of thousands of people were reading these articles and leaving comments on them. So the feedback, like most people, if they have a brand new blog, realistically, they don't have any readers. So they're not going to get much feedback, very minimal feedback. But from day one, the first article I wrote, I had thousands of comments of feedback. And a lot of that, people, as you're aware from Twitter, but it was more so in the comment section because it was more anonymous. If you write a bad article, people will tell you in no uncertain terms. So I just had so much feedback and had so much volume experience. I was doing it so much that I think that's the best way that you can learn is when you have a lot of repetition and a lot of constant feedback. You put those two things together. And then over the course of 10 years, of course, you're going to gain some sort of skill. If you have those two things and you don't get better over 10 years, then there's something wrong with it. So that's where I learned to write. I write a lot less now. I only write 1 article per week now. And the process now is, there's not a lot of structure to it. I don't know if this is going to be that much of an interesting story because there's not a big process that I have. It's just a lot of reading, a lot of going for walks and thinking about whatever topics are on my mind, trying to piece things together. What have I read recently that I thought was a really neat story? And how does that apply to something that I can tie back into economics and investing? And, this reminds me of that. And that reminds me of this. It's just a lot of just wandering around my house, thinking about those things. And then, so that's 90% of the work is just kind of aimless reading, aimless going for walks and thinking, sitting on my couch and thinking about things. It doesn't look like work, but it is. It's trying to piece things together so that by the time I actually sit down and write an article, that's maybe 10% of the actual work. It doesn't take that much time to sit down and write it. And the other thing that's true about the writing, and this is true for I think every writer, if they're honest about it at least, is that when I sit down to start writing an article, I really don't have much of an idea of where it's going to go because the process of writing is what makes you think. It's like you write one sentence and you're like, oh, that reminds me of this. And you write another sentence and you're like, oh, wait, does that contradict something else I wrote in the previous paragraph? So now I got to change that. It's not like you have the whole thing laid out in your head and then you sit down and just smash the keyboard and it's done. It's not like that at all. It's this process of the practice. It's often viewed as writing is the way that you communicate, but I don't think that's really the case, or at least that's only part of it. Writing is the way that you think. Writing is the process of getting your thoughts out there and crystallizing these vague thoughts that you have in your head. So that's really, there's not much more to it than that. It's just a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, and then just kind of grinding through. It doesn't get any easier over time. I think the actual writing, the actual clicking the keyboard gets easier over time. Crafting a sentence gets easier over time. But piecing things together I don't think I'm ever going to run out of material, but it doesn't get easier over time. It's still kind of a weekly grind of figuring out what I'm going to write about next.
It's interesting because it reminds me of the saying, and I'll butcher it, but it's basically like if you got to cut down a tree, spend 4 hours sharpening the axe before you start swinging type situation, right? Similar here of like you spend a lot of time thinking, and then you have a general idea of where you're going to go. And so, do you ever get like writer's block or anything like that in terms of you've already done a lot of the kind of mental work of okay, this is the topic, and here's like maybe the pieces that I want to put together in it. Does that help you kind of avoid any sort of writer's block, or do you still get some of that?
The most important part about writer's block for me is this. If there's one metric that I know of in which is going to predict whether an article I write is going to do very well, it's how easy it was for me to write the article. If I sit down and write an article and it just comes out so easily, I just hit the keys and like first draft is perfect, those are the articles that are going to do really well. If I'm struggling to get through something and I'm just writing, I'm like, this isn't clear. It's not good. I don't know what I want to say. That's always because I don't think there's any exception to it. That's always because the idea that I have is not right. It's not a good idea. And I'm struggling to write it because the idea sucks. Versus if the idea is good and the idea is clear, it's really easy to just go out there and type it out and put it out there. So whenever I get to writer's block, to me, that's a signal, not that I'm struggling with writing. To me, that's a signal that whatever my idea is, my thesis is for the article is wrong. And I should take a step back and say, what's going on here? I think if there's like a skill when you've been doing it for more than a decade, is that I can quickly kind of triage when that happens and say, oh, okay, look, I've been working on this piece for only 30 minutes, but I can already tell this is not going anywhere, and let's just abandon it and move on. And I think that's a really important thing versus just struggling and working so hard on a piece that you know is going to suck. And then you put it out there and it's going to hurt your reputation. No one else is going to like it too. So that's always a signal to me for writer's block.
It's like a great investor, cut your losers early.
That's exactly it. It's the same philosophy. Yeah.
So a lot of this obviously is you are consuming tons of information, you're ingesting that, you're synthesizing it, and then you're kind of putting your own unique perspective and then kind of creating your own content. I saw a couple people asking, what are the types of content that you consume? And also, what do you pay for versus not pay for? And kind of, I think people are really just looking for recommendations in terms of like, what does Morgan think is high quality content that maybe I could read as well?
So let me start with what I pay for. I pay for Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic. That's it. Yeah, that's what I pay for. And those are great. Those are great for news, like capital N news, like journalism, which is really important. But you're not going to get the really nuanced take from that kind of stuff. Those are good to get your facts about the world. But the takes I get, which is the really important part, virtually everything I read comes through Twitter. And books, I would say. That's like the barbell of my information intake is Twitter and books. And I would say if there's one philosophy that I have about reading, it's that I think I got this idea from Patrick O'Shaughnessy, where he said you want a really wide funnel and then a really tight filter. So I try to read anything and everything that might look slightly interesting to me in a wide variety of topics. I almost never read investing books, but I read books about all kinds of topics. And I read articles about all kinds of different fields, not just economics and investing, but politics and biology and history and biographies, like all kinds of different stuff. A really wide filter, but then a really wide funnel. But then the tight filter is, again, just like writing, I think I can triage really quickly when I start reading something within a couple sentences to say, nope, this is not for me. I'm out of here. It's either bad writing or it's about a topic that I'm not interested in. So I think that's a good reading philosophy, whether it's online or books. Try to get your eyes on as many things possible, as many shots on goal as you can, but then cut your losses very quickly so you can move on. People should not have any guilt whatsoever reading books, including my book. If you're reading it and you don't like it, don't waste your time. There's a lot of good books out there. Don't waste your time on bad ones. Don't burden yourself with bad books. So that's the reading philosophy that I have. I try to read as much as I possibly can and move on from the bad stuff as quickly as possible.